have it go to the cloud.
Okay, it's been recorded.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and give me a thumbs up if you can see the election administration study. Okay, great. All right. Good morning. I'm Greg Whittams, Voter Education Chair and member of the Election Administration Study Team. Before we begin our presentation, we'd like to give you a roadmap. First, we'll talk about the steps in our election administration study. Second, we'll show you a timeline. And third, we'll show you how we prepared this study. Many thanks to the election administration teammates who have contributed: Julie Adolphson, Melanie Bussey, Laura Marcus Mountjoy, and Stan Sexton. The steps in the study are as follows. First, members learn about voter registration roll management, and college student voting. Second, we'll identify timely and relevant proposals. Those first two steps we'll do today. Then, membership, which is you, will consider relevant consensus questions that will be used to develop positions. And finally, membership will formally adopt positions that enable league advocacy of policies that defend and strengthen election administration. So here's our timeline. In December and January, we published introductory e-voter primers that have been published. These can be found on the positions page of the League of Women Voters Kansas City website. At this January membership meeting, we are giving an educational presentation of study materials to you. Today, there will be 35 minutes of presentation and about 55 minutes for questions and answers. The consensus meetings will follow, with the first being on Wednesday, January the 31st at the Waldo Library from 6:30 to 8, or you can attend the Saturday, February 3rd consensus meeting at the Plaza Branch from 10 to noon, or you can attend the Tuesday, February 13th consensus meeting via Zoom. You only need to attend one consensus meeting. Finally, on Saturday, March 2nd, at the Northeast Library, per league bylaws, members will vote to accept proposed positions. So what are consensus meetings? At these meetings, members discuss and answer consensus questions. From the discussion, a sense of the group emerges that is used to elaborate positions. Last year's study had important contributions from members based on members' direct experience with elections. And again, you only need to attend one consensus meeting. So let's get into the study. This is the second and final year of our election administration study. Last year's study focus was on election worker intimidation, election challengers, voter intimidation, and arms at the polls, as well as early voting as a way of defending election administration. From last year's study, we crafted positions that have been used in advocacy already. This year, our focus is on voter registration roll management, and college voters. Inside of voter registration, there are three subtopics: automatic voter registration, Missouri's historic noncompliance with the 1993 National Voter Registration Act, the NVRA, and third-party voter registration. That's where an organization like the League of Women Voters registers voters. Like last year, the criteria we used to elevate an issue as an area of focus were the following: where we saw relevant and timely legislation, either positive or negative, nationally or in Missouri, as well as suggestions from interviewees in election administration and faculty at institutions of higher learning. Practical, boots-on-the-ground perspectives of interviewees had impact on our study. Julie will tell you more about these interviews in her college voters presentation. Here's how our work and our presentation is organized. The study materials have 6 dimensions. 1, terms to know. Early in our presentations, we identify topic-specific vocabulary. Concerns. Here we identify problems. This year, problems relate to barriers to registering voters and threats to voter registrations. Primers. In our work, we curate documents that introduce themes to the layperson. We identify existing and proposed legislation, as well as important litigation and model practices. As examples, we have written possible positions, statements that can enable advocacy. We pose consensus questions to be considered by membership at consensus meetings. Now, Melanie Bussey will begin our presentation with the topic of voter registration. Okay, let's pause the recording. We don't need to pause the recording. Hey, Julie. Okay, so now Melanie Bussey will begin our presentation with the topic of voter registration.
Okay, there are two major components of the study on registration. One is automatic voter registration, and the second is Missouri's compliance with the National Voting Rights Act. Definitions. The National Voter Registration Act of 1993, also known as the NVRA or Motor Voter Law, sets forth certain voter registration requirements with respect to elections for federal office. The pending Freedom to Vote Act sets baseline national standards to protect the freedom to vote. It builds off momentum in states around the country to put in place pro-voter policies. Together with the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which would restore and update the full protections of the landmark Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Freedom to Vote Act would be the most comprehensive pro-democracy law enacted in decades. It would make automatic voter registration the national standard. The bill requires AVR to be offered at state departments of motor vehicles and provides funding for that purpose and for expanding it to other agencies. It also establishes privacy and security protections, including protections for persons inadvertently registered. AVR, automatic voter registration, is when eligible voters are automatically registered to vote when they provide information to a participating government agency unless they opt out. Concerns. While a total of 24 states and the District of Columbia have some form of automatic registration, Missouri does not. While the League of Women Voters has a history of supporting AVR, it does not have a stated position that explicitly endorses automatic voter registration. And finally, Missouri has a history of non-compliance with the NVRA. Primers. The National Conference of State Legislatures, which is the first primer, the Summary Automatic Voter Registration, provides an overview of AVR, including the Oregon model that was implemented in January of 2016. Under this model, an eligible voter who interacts with the DMV is not asked whether they would like to register to vote, but is instead automatically opted into registering. Shortly after, the voter is sent a notification by mail informing them that they were registered. They can opt out of registration by returning the notification. Other states that have adopted AVR have chosen different approaches characterized by the point at which a voter may opt out of being registered to vote. In the case for AVR by the Brennan Center for Justice, they find that automatic voter registration would add up to 50 million eligible voters to the rolls permanently. It would save money, increase accuracy, and improve the security of our elections. The primer MIT Election Data and Science provides the benefits and drawbacks to AVR. With automatic voter registration, statewide agencies that collect relevant information about potential eligible voters can facilitate the process of registration for voters and election officials, automatically registering many individuals who may otherwise not have registered. Advocates of AVR nationwide praise the way the policy bolsters turnout by removing a significant barrier for voters, especially for those belonging to racial and age minority groups. While some researchers claim the effects of AVR on turnout are substantial and should be celebrated, other studies find the results to be inconclusive and say that those being registered via the channels of AVR are not likely to turn out to vote. And the final primer is information on the lawsuit that was filed by the League of Women Voters of Missouri and others, and resulting in a settlement agreement against Secretary of State Ashcroft. Voter registration, current federal law, there's just one, the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, also known as the NVRA or Motor Voter Law, sets forth certain voter registration requirements with respect to elections for federal office. Section 5 of the NVRA requires that states offer voter registration opportunities at state motor vehicle agencies. Section 6 of the NVRA requires that states offer voter registration opportunities by mail-in application, and Section 7 of the NVRA requires that states offer voter registration opportunities at certain state and local offices, including public assistance and disability offices. Pending legislation. The Freedom to Vote Act, pending in the United States legislature, was reintroduced in July of 2023. It has yet to be voted on or passed, but it is a comprehensive voting rights bill that would establish national voting standards in partisan gerrymandering, tackle felony disfranchisement, require the disclosure of top donors, and create protections for nonpartisan election officials. Specifically, the Freedom to Vote Act would make November election days a public holiday, enact automatic voter registration for each state, and require same-day voter registration and early voting periods in each state. There are more elements of it, but those are the basics. The other current proposed legislation is actually House Bill 1686, introduced by Donna Applebaum, a Democrat from District 71 in St. Louis. This is out of this year's legislative session, and it creates a section titled the Missouri Voter Fraud Protection Act, a statewide system of automatic voter registration. It provides that every eligible voter in the state shall be automatically registered to vote unless the voter indicates that he or she doesn't want to be registered. It also designates state agencies to serve as sources for voter registration information. As of January 24th, the bill had been read a second time, but has not been sent to the committees. This bill is same as bills introduced in 2023 and 2022 that did not make it through the legislative session. Model legislation is the Oregon model. In January 2016, Oregon became the first state to implement automatic voter registration. In what is sometimes referred to as the Oregon model, an eligible voter who interacts with the DMV is not asked whether they would like to register to vote, but instead automatically opted into registering. Shortly thereafter, the voter is sent a notification by mail informing them they were registered. They can opt out of registration by returning the notification. I'm just kind of comparing my notes here. The benefits of automatic voter registration say that the policy removes barriers to registration for eligible voters, a step toward increasing voter participation. By registering through a routine and necessary transaction, such as those at the DMV, voters won't have to worry about registration deadlines or application submissions. Automatic registration can also help with voter registration list maintenance because the process updates existing registrations with current addresses. Precise voter rolls facilitate election accuracy while reducing the use of provisional ballots, a fail-safe voting option when there is a discrepancy in a voter's registration status, but which costs more to process. Some supporters also say automatic voter registration leads to a higher voter turnout, although evidence supporting this claim is mixed. It also shifts the burden of voter registration away from individuals and onto the government in the process. You can change slides.
Okay. You have
Sorry.
in your speaker notes, what are the disadvantages?
Oh, okay, sorry. What are the disadvantages of automatic voter registration? Opponents of automatic voter registration may say that the government should not tell citizens they must register to vote, particularly in states that provide the opt-out choice by mail after the fact. Furthermore, they question whether opt-out forms that are sent and received through the mail are sufficient to ensure an individual can decline to register. According to a report by the Brennan Center for Justice, AVR markedly increased the number of voters being registered, though the increases varied widely, ranging from 9 to 94% across states. These increases were found in states with large and small populations and across party lines as well. Using these and other data, a report from the Center for American Progress that projected the impact of AVR if it was expanded to all 50 states claimed that if every state adopted the same system as Oregon, more than 22 million new voters across the country would be registered in the first year alone. In a publication in Demos regarding Oregon's AVR, they found that a significant share of individuals registered through AVR voted, that AVR increased the racial and age diversity of Oregon's voters, and that AVR increased the income diversity of Oregon's voters. You can go on. Okay. Key facts. This has to go with the lawsuit. Well, I need to add that I need a new transition thing there. Okay. Around August 1st, 2017, the Missouri Department of Revenue revised their change of address process, effectively eliminating the step through which customers could update their address with the Secretary of State's office or local election authority that is a requirement under the Motor Vehicle Provisions, Section 5 of the NVRA. Under Section 5, when a registered voter updates their address with the state's motor vehicle agency, the agency is supposed to automatically update the voter's registration address unless the voter requests that the update not occur. The League of Women Voters Missouri and 2 other plaintiffs sought relief in advance of the November general election to ensure that no Missouri voter would be disenfranchised as a result of the defendant's failure to provide these address update services. The lawsuit alleged that because of the policy, voters who had moved within the state went to polls and found that they were no longer on the rolls and could not cast a ballot. Judge Brian Wimes issued an order on September 21st, 2018, instructing the state of Missouri to take immediate steps to prevent Missourians from being denied the right to vote in that November's election as a result of the state's failure to comply with federal law. The Secretary of State's office had to mail 22,404 notices to citizens who changed their mailing address on driver and non-driver's licenses with the Department of Revenue between August 1st, 2017 and September 26, 2018. However, the settlement agreement that was entered between the League of Women Voters Missouri and the Secretary of State's office was only for a 2-year period and ended in November of 2020. Possible position. Missouri should support the establishment of AVR where an eligible voter who interacts with the DMV or other state agency is not asked whether they would like to register to vote, but instead automatically opted into registering. Voters would no longer have to worry about registration deadlines or application submissions. While the League of Women Voters has been a leader in promoting and in voting registration efforts around the country and been instrumental in working toward the passage of the NVRA and the Freedom to Vote Act. There is not a stated position that explicitly refers to endorsing automatic voter registration. The League of Women Voters should remain diligent in ensuring that Missouri is in compliance with the NVRA and that the Missouri Department of Motor Vehicles has incorporated voter registration services into their driver's license application, renewal, and change of address processes. If the DMV is not in compliance, the League of Women Voters should continue to partner with other like-minded partners or organizations to litigate the failure of the DMV to comply as it has done in the past. Consensus question 1. While the League of Women Voters has been a leader in voting registration efforts around the country and has been instrumental in working toward the passage of the NVRA and the Freedom to Vote Act, there is not a stated position that explicitly refers to endorsing automatic voter registration. Remember, under automatic voter registration, an eligible voter who interacts with the DMV is not asked whether they would like to register to vote, but instead is automatically opted into registering. Should the league specifically endorse automatic voter registration? Yes, no, why or why not? Question 2A. Should the League of Women Voters support efforts to monitor that Missouri is in compliance with the NVRA and that the Missouri DMV has incorporated voter registration services into their driver's license application, renewal, and change of address processes? Yes, no, why or why not? Question 2B. In the past, the League of Women Voters Missouri ensured that the state of Missouri was compliant with the NVRA, taking action as needed, insisting that the Missouri DMV incorporate voter registration services into driver's license application, renewal, and change of address processes. Question. Should the League of Women Voters litigate or take other actions when the state of Missouri and or the DMV fails to comply with the NVRA? Yes, no, why or why not?
Okay, let's take a quick stop here. It is, I've got 25 recording. And then
Right.
let's remember that we do the handoffs. So you would hand it off to me. So I'll say, okay, let's talk about third-party voter registration, starting with some terms to know. Third-party voter registration, what is it? Well, third-party voter registration drives are often nonpartisan community efforts that encourage and assist people in registering to vote. While almost all states allow voter registration drives, some ban them entirely, and a number of states have implemented restrictions that operate to unduly burden these efforts. The League of Women Voters and the NAACP are examples of groups that conduct third-party voter registration guides. Here's another term to know: core political speech. Core political speech has two important dimensions. First, it can be more than words and include actions like registering voters. The other element of core political speech is that restrictions on core political speech have received the highest scrutiny by the courts. That is, it is the type of free speech that the courts are most likely to protect under the First Amendment. In addition to terms to know, existing law to know include Missouri's House Bill 1878, which restricts the activities of third-party organizations. It was passed in 2022, but enjoined in October 2022 pending a final decision. Also, as previously noted, the First Amendment of the United States Constitution is relevant to this topic. So let's talk about concerns. Kansas and Missouri are among a number of states that have imposed restrictions and barriers to third-party organizations like the League of Women Voters and the NAACP that enable voter participation. The barriers include restrictions on registering voters and informing voters about absentee voting. Let's go back to HB 1878, which, among other things, places restrictions on how organizations like the League of Women Voters can interact with voters. These restrictions would prohibit anyone from approaching their fellow citizens to encourage them to apply to vote absentee, prohibit anyone but registered Missouri voters from attempting to register others to vote in Missouri, require any Missouri voter that wants to encourage voter registration to pre-register with the state in advance, prohibit anyone from compensating others during voter registration efforts. Violation of these provisions are backed by harsh criminal penalties, including the possible loss of the right to vote. As a footnote, we did have members that ceased volunteering to register to vote when the law was initially passed. This Missouri legislation was similar to proposals that passed in other states, including Florida and Kansas. When similar restrictive and punitive legislation passed in Kansas, it resulted in the League of Women Voters of Kansas suspending their voter registration activities. The League of Women Voters of Kansas did not contest the law in court, but it did write an op-ed piece in the Kansas Reflector from which we have extracted this quote. Quote, "We missed out on directly registering any of them to vote. You might wonder, why didn't the League do its work this year? What could possibly keep these more than 1,300 strong members born out of the suffrage movement from registering voter? The short answer is the law," unquote. After passage of the legislation, the League of Women Voters of Missouri and the NAACP challenged parts of the legislation regarding voter registration and discussing absentee voting. The League relied on the United States and Missouri constitutions in challenging the restrictions that House Bill 1878 imposed on third-party voter registration activity. The League's complaint noted that House Bill 1878 targets the League's core political speech by restricting the ability to, quote, "inform, encourage, and assist Missouri voters to engage in the democratic process by registering to vote and applying to vote by absentee ballot." Ultimately, Judge John Beadham enjoined the restrictions on voter registration and absentee voting in large part on the basis of core political speech. Remember, that was a term to know that we introduced at the start of this presentation. Here's how Judge Beadham described how League of Women voter registration and voter advocacy activities can be considered core political speech. Quote, "Engaging and assisting voters in registering to vote or applying to cast an absentee ballot is," quote, "the type of interactive communication concerning political speech that is appropriately described as core political speech." And he further asserted that courts have repeatedly held that voter registration activities constitute core political speech. And he noted the limits that government has in restricting that speech. Quote, "At its core, the right to free speech means that government has no power to restrict expression because of its message, its ideas, its subject matter, or its content." If you would like to read more on this topic, the primers we cite here are layman-friendly discussions. One describes how voter registration is considered protected political speech. The other is the League of Women Voters United States discussion of the litigation and the timeline. There are no existing League positions that explicitly discuss the League's voter registration efforts. And absent an existing position, here's an example of what a possible position might look like. The League of Women Voters should defend its right to engage and assist voters in registering to vote and participate in the democratic process, and should contest efforts to restrict our voter registration activities. We believe that these pro-voting activities are protected under the United States and Missouri Constitution as core political free speech. So here's consensus question 1. Are the League of Women Voters actions that engage voters and promote voting an expression of political speech that should be protected under the First Amendment? Yes, no, why, or why not? Question 2. Should the League of Women Voters actively defend, including through litigation, its right to engage voters and promote voting? Yes, no, why, or why not? And now we will go to Stan, who will talk about voter registration roll management. Okay, how many minutes was that?
7:48, so 7 minutes.
7 minutes? Okay, that's similar to, yeah, I said, okay, so we're good there. Okay, so let's fast forward now and let's go to college voters. And whoops, went too fast. And now here's Julie Adelson to talk about college student voting. Oh, have we got the recording going?
Yes, I never turned it off.
Okay, good. All right, take it away, Julie.
All right, thank you. Most of you know that historically, 18 to 24-year-olds have the lowest voter turnout numbers in the nation. The good news is that in the 2020 presidential election, the national student voting rate was 66%, a remarkable 14-point increase from 2016 and nearly equal to the turnout number of 67% for the entire U.S. population. In 2020, the rate of registered students who then voted hit 80%, up from 69% in 2016. Sadly, many states such as Missouri have enacted laws or policies which present significant barriers to sustaining these gains in student voter participation. We'll talk about these barriers and what we as an organization might do to help mitigate them. College students include anyone in the 18 to 25-year-old range going to any post-secondary educational program. As a personal context, which is sort of driving my interest in this part of our study, is that all 4 of my boys attended all types of college, university, trade school programs in Missouri, from Metropolitan Community College through UMKC Law School. Jurisdiction includes both location and authority. And election authority includes Kansas City, for instance, has an election board, while in less populated counties, elections are administered by the county clerk's office. It's important to note that elections are just one of many duties county clerks and their staff have. A polling place or venue is where a vote is cast. In early voting, at locations designated by the election authority or on election day in predetermined locations designated by the election authority. Kansas City election board has some flexible locations, but in Cass County, you have to vote in specific locations based upon your address on election day. Absentee voting includes in-person early voting. Seems sort of like an oxymoron, but the locations and deadlines along with notarization, which can be barriers to college students. No excuse absentee voting. During the 2 weeks before an election, you may vote a no excuse absentee ballot in person at a location designated by the election authority. 6 weeks prior to an election, you can vote early at a designated location for specific reasons, such as incapacity or confinement due to illness or physical disability. Expect to be absent on election day, or if election workers, first responders, or healthcare workers, or members of law enforcement need to vote outside of the election day. If you're prevented by religious beliefs from going to the polls on election day, if you're incarcerated but haven't lost the right to vote, and active duty military personnel and close family members living with them, and Missouri citizens living outside the United States. And finally, a student ID is a photo ID issued by a college or university or other type of post-secondary school, but it's not allowed for voting in Missouri. We'll talk more about that on the next slide. So Missouri has a strict voter ID law. And in Missouri then, as a result of HB 1878, which we heard about earlier, voters must present a Missouri driver's license or a non-driver's license photo ID from the Department of Motor Vehicles, not expired before the last general election, or a non-expired military ID or non-expired U.S. passport. If a voter doesn't have one of these, they can go home and get it and bring it back before the polls close, or they can vote a provisional blue ballot. And if the provisional ballot signature matches the signature on the registration or another signature on file with the clerk's office, for example, then the vote counts. Getting a photo ID at the Missouri DMV is difficult and costly, as I'm sure you're all aware and have experienced. The free photo ID is a non-driver ID, and students would have to surrender their out-of-state driver's license so they no longer can legally drive. And there may also be some insurance and tax consequences. Where and how to register and vote can present significant challenge to students. Where do they vote? Where should they vote? More on that on the next slide. Finally, many of us may not recall our early voting experience, but we learned a lot from the Missouri State University about how the lack of experience and knowledge can affect students' confidence and therefore their likelihood of voting. Also in colleges, some administration or staff or faculty face increasing external pressure and can become risk averse in the political environment in which they find themselves. Other states, in this example in Texas, are proposing or enacting barriers to college students' engagement in voting. The dramatic increase in students voting and getting more involved civically since 2016 has garnered additional attention and efforts to suppress their votes, as seen in one political strategist's view. Meanwhile, teen and young adult activists have been the backbone of many current social movements that we see taking hold today, including movements around climate change, racial justice, gun violence, and the LGBTQ+ rights. Indeed, young people are getting engaged. That's on the rise. So the primers, the League of Women Voters US has a good one-pager which recommends identifying partner schools in your area, establishing contact with students, and we'll have a little caveat on that in a moment, and building a mutually empowering relationship. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the Missouri State model, which emphasizes that a passionate faculty staff person needs to oversee students developing a strong student-led program with peer-to-peer interactions and the League of Women Voters playing a supportive role. The Metropolitan Community College system utilizes a campus life and leadership model, which includes a civic action plan that they're really proud of, and a League of Women Voters Kansas City supporting role, along with other nonpartisan nonprofit organizations. And they provide education, registration workshops, mock voting activities to help the students feel more confident in participating in the voting process. So, as I said, the Missouri State model, it really stands out, and we encourage you to read the founders, Suzanne Pacheco's 9-page document linked here on the Pause to the Polls program, which was developed so successfully. And in a nutshell, what is necessary is sustained faculty commitment, peer-to-peer effort that is student-facing and led, and thoughtful curriculum, and the League of Women Voters in a supporting role in all of those efforts. And here there are a number of very useful guides that organizations have made to help students work on a plan so that they can successfully register and vote either within Kansas City or at their home of record. Since 2003, over $4.2 billion in the Help America Vote Act funds have been awarded to the 50 states, the District of Columbia, and 5 U.S. territories. The U.S. Election and Assistance Commission oversees this program. So that is one of the current federal laws that are appropriate here. The Higher Education Act is post-secondary institutions play a critical role in supporting our democratic process and ensuring that all students have access to resources to engage in our electoral process. The HEA ties the federal student aid program to the requirements for students registering and voting. Federal requirements associated with your participation in the federal student aid programs and to share resources support you effectively in meeting those requirements is part of this law. Now, the pending legislation includes, as we heard about before, the Freedom to Vote Act. If it passes, it would, A, ensure that an appropriate number of polling places, not less than one, used on the date of the election will be located on the physical campus of each institution, including such branch campus, and B, ensure that such polling places provide the greatest opportunity for residents of the jurisdiction to vote. In addition to talking with the election board, and I forgot what the F stands for, I'm sorry, local election authority and the Secretary of State, we also had productive discussions with people in various academic settings. Practical boots on the ground perspectives of interviewees had a very big impact on our study. It was clear from our interviews and documents review that the League of Women Voters Kansas City support role will be impactful, and that successful programs like Missouri State's Pause to the Polls requires passionate faculty oversight. Curriculums need to incorporate civic engagement early, and like in an orientation class, for instance, for incoming freshmen, and that students need to be empowered to lead in a peer-to-peer effort. So, possible positions. The League of Women Voters Kansas City should continue and increase support to schools and oppose strict photo ID requirements to voting. The League of Women Voters should oppose absentee voting policies that disenfranchise voters, such as not counting a ballot if signed on the inside flap instead of the outside flap of an inner envelope, for instance, requiring notarization, and postal service delays leading to not counting votes because the requirement to count is that when the ballot is received and not when it's postmarked. The League of Women Voters in Kansas City should support campus polling locations. Consensus questions. Many students lack experience, knowledge, and confidence, as I mentioned, in the process of registering and casting their vote. So question, do you believe a significant number of college students hesitate to vote because they lack experience, confidence, and knowledge on the process? Yes, no, and why or why not? Another question. First, from our research, we found that in Greene County, the League of Women Voters of Greene County supported Dr. Susan Pacheco, professor of anthropology, who said, quote, I incorporated a social justice civic engagement theme to the course and called on members of the League of Women Voters to conduct a voting simulation activity in the class. This demonstrated how the relatively small proportion of people who vote in the U.S. make important decisions for all citizens. Question, Should the League of Women Voters Kansas City further develop partnerships and interactions with campus organizations? Yes or no, and why or why not? Missouri's HB 1878 has some of the nation's narrowest voter ID requirements, as it disallows the use of a student ID as an acceptable photo identification to vote. Per the Voters' Riders Summary of Voting ID Requirements of the 10 states outside of Missouri with strict voter ID, only 3 disallow student IDs as an acceptable form of photo identification to vote. So question, do strict voter ID laws, including those which disallow college IDs, unnecessarily disenfranchise voters, including college voters? Yes, no, why, or why not? Voter ID laws have long been debated in the United States. While supporters argue that voter photo ID laws are necessary to prevent voter fraud and ensure the integrity of elections, reality tells a different story. Not only do these measures disproportionately impact Black, Native, elderly, and student voters, but they also fail to effectively address any real issues related to the election integrity, the very thing that advocates say these measures are designed to do. And this is from the League of Women Voters US webpage. So question, should students be allowed to use valid college ID to vote? Yes or no, and why or why not? And finally, given what we know about absentee voter processes in Missouri, should this be, oh, I'm sorry, I was going to ask if it should be deleted because we worded it another way in the next slide.
Okay.
Question. Does the Missouri absentee voter process disenfranchise college voters because of clerical error, notarization burdens, and the efficiency of the Postal Service by imposing requirements of when received at the election authority rather than postmarked? Why, yes or no, and why or why not?
Oh, okay. So we got 2 questions here.
Right, and it's the same thing, but it was worded 2 different ways, and so I don't know which slide we need to.
Yeah, let's put let's see. Let's make sure we time out the clock too. Take it away, Stan.
Thank you. My topic, and that was also by Laura Marcus Montjoy, is voter registration roll management. And when you talk about voter registration rolls, we need to keep in mind certain terms that we need to understand. Voter registration lists are lists of eligible voters, also referred to as voter rolls. They form the foundation for nearly everything in election administration. They're always changing because you got new registrants who are added to the rolls, and existing registrants move, die, or otherwise become ineligible, and thus are removed from the rolls. In Missouri, the voter database is maintained by the Secretary of State, but the actual additions and deletions from the database are accomplished by the individual 116 voting election officials in the state. When we talk about list maintenance, we're actually talking about that process of adding newly registered voters to the roll and removing disqualified voters from the roll. So it's important that when you get the information to add or remove voters from the rolls, that information be accurate. Newly registered voters should be added to the rolls, and the Secretary of State and election officials share information with one another to assist in this maintenance. In Missouri, list maintenance is currently accomplished by the Secretary of State sending the local election officials reports of deaths in Missouri, which comes from the Missouri Department of Health and Senior Services, reports from the Missouri Department of Corrections for people who are incarcerated for felony convictions, reports received from the National Change of Address Program administered by the Postal Service to document moves. And as you can see from this slide, we're talking about quite a few things. I mean, 40 million people change addresses each year on average. Missouri has almost 74,000 deaths on average. We've got 67,000 people incarcerated. So before Missouri belonged to ERIC, which we will talk about in a moment, the Electronic Registration Information Center, they would send 7 different reports that we'll discuss later. But for our purposes here, this is the information that the Secretary of State gives to the local election officials. And we're talking about 2 boards of election in St. Louis and in Kansas City. And then all the rest of them are county clerks of the 115 remaining counties in the state of Missouri. Local officials do their own list maintenance by reviewing local obituaries. They can canvass their registered voters. Canvass means they send out a letter or a postcard and request a return to verify if there's been a change of address. Like I said, only 2 of the 116 local election officials are election boards, which have large staffs. The remainder usually have 2 or 3 employees to do not just the work of the elections and the voter roll maintenance, but for everything else that they do as a county clerk. Purging is an important concept to understand for voter roll management and maintenance. Voters who die, move from their jurisdiction, or are convicted of a felony should be removed from the rolls. But there are rules governing when and if voters who don't vote can be removed or purged from the rolls. Given all the information about the accuracy of elections and activism spawned by such claims, and I guess I should say inaccuracy of elections, by political parties and partisan organizations, the practice of voter caging has developed. And what this is, it allows multiple challenges to the registration of individual voters. Voters identified as unfriendly or unfavorable to a candidate or an issue are sent registered letters, which, if returned undelivered, will later result in a challenge to that voter's registration for not maintaining an address within the jurisdiction. So you have voter purging and voter caging, both of which can result in the removal of potentially eligible voters from the rolls. Now, the primer here is the Brennan's purges, a growing threat to the right to vote. And just as an aside here, there is no constitutional right to vote in the United States. You won't find it anywhere in the Constitution. However, the state of Missouri's Constitution does include a constitutional right to vote. But in the last 5 years, states have engaged in illegal purges or implemented unlawful purge rules in their statutory schemes. Purge rates increased nationally after 2008. The Shelby versus Holder decision, which was in Birmingham, Alabama, which removed Section 2 authority for pre-clearance changes in voter rules, led immediately to higher purge rates in the covered states. The federal protections against improper purges rely upon executive branch vigilance, and those protections fell after 2016. Activist groups are pressuring administrators and legislatures to conduct more aggressive purges. Purges have disenfranchised voters based on faulty data. This has happened in Georgia, Texas, and Arkansas. And purges have removed voters from rolls based on inactivity after missing only one election cycle in Ohio. And that is contrary to federal law, which requires you to miss 2 presidential election cycles. So the concerns that we have is that voter maintenance doesn't always comply with federal elections. Some voting groups are selectively targeted. Voters are unaware that they've been removed from the rolls. Voter registrations are removed based on faulty data relied upon for purges. And some of the new and proposed state legislations ignore federal protections regarding notice and discrimination. Now, voter registrations are removed based on faulty data. There's some examples Texas had a faulty data for non-citizen data. Crosscheck, which was a predecessor of ERIC and is a third-party voter maintenance organization, had a faulty database with a demographic skew, and that there are weak matches. And we'll get to talk about weak matches in a moment. The long and the short of it is, if you don't have, it's garbage in, garbage out. If you don't have good information on voter data and who's moved and who's died, then you can end up removing people from the rolls that belong on the rolls. In Texas, Secretary of State created a list of 100,000 suspected non-citizens based on faulty data, namely the last name, based on a Hispanic origin, Lopez, Gonzalez, the like. The use of the list was successfully challenged in court, and ultimately only 80 of the 100,000 people were found to be ineligible. Virginia has error rates as high as 17%, when in 2013, they purged 40,000 voters using faulty data from Crosscheck. This was a system that was then administered by the Kansas Secretary of State, and this is even before the Chris Kobach era. According to a 2016 analysis, minorities were more likely than white voters to be flagged for removal in Crosscheck. Weak matches mean that the chances that a person identified was actually ineligible are too low to be trusted. For an example, a voter whose birth date and the last 4 digits of their social security number matches a dead person's record would be a weak match. Interestingly, on an average day in the United States, over 902,000 people share the same birthday. Out of 119 people, there's a 50% chance that 2 of them will have the same last digits in their social security number. So those weak matches cannot and should not be used to remove voters from the rolls. Another example, on these grounds, a living Texas voter, an Air Force veteran named James Harris Jr. was flagged for removal because he shared information with an Arkansan, James Harris, who had died in 1996. According to one analysis, more than 68,000 of the 80,000 voters identified were as dead were weak matches. And you also have the problem and a concern with voter roll management based on purges because of voter inactivity. That targets lower income voters who don't necessarily turn out for each election cycle, targets voters of color, and response rate to pre-purge notices can be as low as 10%. So just imagine this. You get something, a postcard in your mail. I live on 50th or on Warnell, and I always get mail addressed to 50th Street. And so if your voter notice came to my house, it may not have made its way to you. And these pre-purges notice are as low as 10% for actual notification of the voter. Proposed Missouri legislation, SB 1025, would mandate the removal of a voter's registration from the list of registered voters if the voter fails to respond to a notice and is not engaged in activity during 2 general election cycles. The bill does not require that the voter be informed that they have been or will be removed. Federal law provides the foundation for most election law requirements. The Voting Rights Act, the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, the Help America Vote Act of 2002, have provisions that protect registered voters from having their registrations purged or removed from the voter rolls. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 prohibits racial discrimination in voter registration roll management. The National Voter Registration Act of 1993, the so-called Motor Voter Act, in addition to ensuring that every eligible citizen has an opportunity to register to vote through the Department of Motor Vehicles, The law provides that list maintenance must be uniform, non-discriminatory, in accordance with the Voting Rights Act. It also prohibits systematic voter purges, those programs that remove groups of voters at once within 90 days of any federal election. The National Voter Registration Act, 1993, prohibits removing registrants from the list solely on their basis of failure to vote. The Help America Vote Act of 2002 requires states to create a national voter registration database with unique identifiers for registered voters. The law requires states to attempt to verify the validity of the information submitted by voter registration applicants. HAVA also ensures that certain voters, including those who do not appear on poll books, be permitted to vote on provisional ballots at a minimum. So the voter registration database that Missouri currently has was formulated based on the requirements of this act from 2002. And also the Missouri statutes, 115.158, charges the Secretary of State with maintaining centralized information on the voter registration compliant with the NVRA. And this is how we have the actual database maintained by the Secretary of State, but the actual changes, the purges, the removals, and the additions are made by the 116 individual election officials in the state. The League of Women Voters U.S. position and litigation has been to protect voting rights by holding state and local election officials accountable for compliance with federal law and thus from impermissible voter urges. And the requirement, unfortunately, falls upon organizations like the League of Women Voters, the NAACP, certain nonprofit organizations to bring these lawsuits because our state elected officials that have the responsibility failed to discharge that responsibility. Possible positions for voter registration roll management. 1, voter registration maintenance should be uniform and non-discriminatory. Voters should be provided with public and individualized notice prior to purging or removal from voter registration lists. So a public notice would be a statement by the Secretary of State that they intend to remove en masse a series of voters. The individualized notice would be actually receiving a postcard or a letter from your local election official advising you of that purge. Possible position number 2, voter registrations cannot be removed solely on the basis of inactivity. Voter registrations should not be based on inactivity. Once you register to vote, you remain entitled to vote. Consensus questions. 1A. Per the NVRA, voter registrations cannot be removed solely on the basis of inactivity. In 28 states, non-voting is not a basis for removal. Contrariwise, in 22 states, it is. Should the League of Women Voters oppose legislation and practices that remove registration solely on the basis of inactivity? Yes, no, and why or why not? Question 1B. The Voting Rights Act prohibits discriminatory practices in voter registration list management. Should political parties, and perhaps even other organizations, be allowed to use caging and purging methods, often geographically targeted, to remove registered voters from the voter registration rolls? Yes, no, why, or why not? Consensus question number 2. Some states have passed laws that do not meet federal notice standards to protect registered voters from having their registrations purged from the voter rolls in their state jurisdictions. Should voters be provided with public and individualized notice prior to purging removal from voter registration lists? Yes, no, why, or why not? Now, at this part of the presentation, we're going to shift gears a bit to talk about voter registration roll management by third-party organizations to assist. I've already mentioned the cross-check system that Kansas had enacted back in the 90s, and I've already mentioned ERIC. ERIC is the Electronic Registration Information Center. It's nonprofit, nonpartisan, created by and composed of state election officials from around the United States, and it was founded in 2012. ERIC is funded and governed by states that choose to join. The fee to pay for membership is $25,000. The annual fee has been running at about $34,000. ERIC is an example of a third-party organization that assists election officials in maintaining voter registration rolls. ERIC is an effective tool to help election officials and maintain accurate rolls and detect possible illegal voting. It helps states reach out to potentially eligible but not yet registered voters with information on how best to register to vote. While Missouri joined ERIC in 2017, it left in 2023. Now, during the time that Missouri was a member of ERIC, ERIC reports provided to the state of Missouri identified 73,883 Missourians who had died and needed to be taken off the rolls. It identified 41,000 inmates who were ineligible to vote. And it had a huge effect on voter roll management. Clearly, the more help election officials, especially those with 2 or 3 people in their office, get, the better their lists can be maintained. Now, Missouri, now let's talk a little bit more about what ERIC provided. ERIC provided 4 list maintenance reports. So think of this, you've got the state of Missouri has their voter registration list. The state of Illinois has their voter registration list. The state of Kentucky or Tennessee have their lists. Those lists, if they're members of ERIC, are pooled together. And the software is written such that they can identify people who move cross-state from one state to another, which is a big issue in St. Louis because of the proximity of East St. Louis, Illinois. So cross-state mover report identifies voters who appear to have moved from one ERIC state to another using those voter registration data and Missouri and motor vehicle data. The in-state movers report simply identifies those people who maybe moved from Boonville, Missouri to Kansas City. The duplicate report identifies voters with duplicate registrations in the same state using voter registration data. There's nothing illegal about being duplicately registered, but you can only vote in one place, and that's the place where your residency is. So it is important to identify those to remove people from voter registration rolls where they do not live. And then finally, you have the deceased report that I mentioned earlier. ERIC also provided Missouri with 3 qualitative type reports. One was eligible but unregistered report. This was significant. It identifies individual who appears to be eligible, but who are not yet registered by matching voter registration data against motor vehicle data. So if you come into the state of Missouri, you should be, under the Motor Voter Act, given an opportunity to register to vote when you get your Missouri driver's license. But if they fail to give you that opportunity, this report from ERIC would then follow those people and give them the opportunity to register that they didn't get when they got their driver's license. The National Change of Address report is a more comprehensive report on people who've moved. And like I may have alluded to earlier, 40 million people in the United States move every year. And the third one was the voter participation report, which after each federal general election, states can get a report identifying potential illegal voting activity, voters who may cast ballots in more than one state, or more than one ballot in the same state, or who have voted on behalf of a deceased voter. And in the 2020 election, through this report, Missouri Secretary of State was notified that residents of St. Charles, Missouri, husband and wife, voted in person in Missouri and by mail in Florida. Without this report, you couldn't find that information from anything that the state has. So the next slide. Losing my speaker notes here just a moment. So Missouri's withdrawal from ERIC has deprived Missouri election officials of these 7 tailored reports. So they don't have this available to them anymore. And they're left with what I mentioned earlier, which is what the Secretary of State provides. And it has caused Missouri to abandon any outreach to register eligible but unregistered voters. During membership in ERIC, Missouri was able to identify 21,700 deceased voters, 18,242 in-state duplicate registrations, 368,420 in-state mover updates, and 383,884 cross-state movers to maintain the accuracy of these rolls for the one-time membership fee of $25,000 and an annual cost of $34,000 per year. Now, why did Missouri leave ERIC? Well, the Secretary of State withdrew from ERIC because he came to the realization that ERIC's operations, including its focus on voter registration, raised concerns about partisanship. It could also be understood that the Secretary of State of Missouri attended a conference by the Heritage Foundation and listened to Cleta Mitchell in February 14 and 15 of 2023, and then came back from that conference and withdrew Missouri on March 6 of 2023, together with Secretary of States from Virginia, West Virginia, Tennessee, Iowa, Alabama, Louisiana, Texas, and Ohio. Now, recently, the state auditor, Scott Fitzgerald, audited the Secretary of State's office on this very issue. And he determined specifically that, quote, the Office of Secretary of State terminated its membership in ERIC, a multi-state election services cooperative, without fully evaluating the benefits received from the membership, consulting key stakeholders, or having plans to fully replace the benefits received from the membership. As a result, the Secretary of State and local election authorities will have less assurance that the voter rolls of the state are reliable and will have less useful and timely information for updating voter registration lists. As the state auditor's office attempted to evaluate the efficacy of the ERIC membership, Secretary of State officials refused to provide reports from ERIC containing potentially duplicate or ineligible voter registration. This data was then requested and obtained directly from ERIC. Doesn't paint a very good picture of how Missouri treats election and voter roll management. So that leads us to the following possible positions. Number 3, outreach efforts should be made to register eligible or ineligible voters.
Unregistered voters.
Unregistered voters. And in this particular instance, that was a requirement for membership in ERIC, but the withdrawal of ERIC doesn't provide any teeth for that requirement to be continued. Possible position number 4, maximum assistance, including use of third-party organizations like ERIC, should be provided by the Secretary of State to local election officials to maintain accuracy of voter rolls. Data from third-party organizations should be based on strong matches and be tested for accuracy prior to use with an objective of minimizing the disfranchisement of eligible voters. Consensus question number 3. Although no federal election law requires it, some states through ERIC implemented efforts to contact eligible but unregistered voters to register to vote. Should Missouri affirmatively implement an outreach program to register eligible but unregistered voters? Yes, no, why, or why not? Question number 4. From 2017 to 2023, Missouri used ERIC as a third-party organization to assist state election officials in maintaining the accuracy of voter rolls, but since leaving ERIC, Missouri no longer has such assistance. Should Missouri rejoin ERIC or join another third-party organization like ERIC to assist state and local election officials in maintaining the accuracy of voter rolls? Yes, no, why, or why not? And then finally, question number 5. In several states, purges using weak matches incorrectly identified voters as ineligible, resulting in elimination from voter rolls. Should data from third-party organizations used in voter registration list maintenance be tested for accuracy prior to use with the objective of minimizing disenfranchising eligible voters? Yes, no, why, or why not?
All right, there we are. What's the time? That's 1:23. Oh gosh. I think I had, so that was, I have 27 minutes. Melanie, what did you have?
Well, 94 slides.